This is the Dover Download Podcast. My name is Christopher Parker, and for the past 25 years, I've had the pleasure of working with, learning from, and talking to a variety of volunteer, staff, and community members. This podcast explores conversations, activities, and a variety of policies and programs which exist here in Dover to improve the community in one way or another. Today, we're going to continue the exploration and conversations about our boards, committees, and commissions. Of the multiple boards, committees, and commissions that we have, the Transportation Advisory Commission is unique in that it is a board that has staff as liaisons that are actually voting members and not just support staff. That, coupled with members that reflect a variety of transportation options, makes this board, I think, unique in our parlance. Today, we're going to sit down with Michael Williams, who's the chair and represents Coast in public transit, and Lieutenant Martin Spidell, who is the principal staff liaison for the TAC. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So am I right about the general gist of the TAC? It's a group made up of folks representing a variety of transit options, transportation options, as well as staff members that are bringing a technical perspective?
That's right. So the TAC is a 9-member appointed board that has 2 alternates. It's comprised of 3 staff liaisons, one from the police department assigned by the chief, one from the planning department assigned by the planning director, and then one from the community services department assigned by the community services director. And then 6 other appointed, city council appointed members. So in theory, city staff, for whatever reason, are voting members, but they don't necessarily have a controlling block. You could have a scenario where all 6 citizen appointees feel strongly about a particular subject and vote one way, whereas city staff might have a recommendation the opposite way, but the vote of the committee and the endorsement of the committee would be a 6-3. So it can happen.
Michael, if I recall correctly, because I was a member of the TAC representing the planning department for a number of years, there's a variety of topics that come before the TAC. They can be policy decisions, such as when we talked about our Complete Streets program and our traffic calming policies. It could be looking at complaints or concerns raised by the public about pedestrian crossings, about stop yield signs, things of that nature. And it can also be looking at providing advice to whether it's police about enforcement options and opportunities or community services about infrastructure improvements to sort of provide that citizen sounding board. Does that sound like what you think you got into?
That does. We've had a number of very specific concerns that come before the committee about a crosswalk at a specific intersection or a speed limit sign or posting at a specific portion of road. And that's a common type of discussion that we have in the committee. But also there are times where there are broader issues such as just walkability of downtown in general or transit access throughout the community that are raised by the committee. So it's really a mix of those smaller details that we dig into and we look at data and we look at recommendations for what to do in a specific scenario and the bigger picture.
One of the things that's jumped out to me over the years is that a lot of times the people making the request, they're hoping to walk out of that room with a certified answer and tomorrow morning the crosswalk gets painted or the stop sign goes up or some other change. But the reality is a lot of it requires some data collection or some observations. We shouldn't be doing things willy-nilly. We should be taking into consideration a variety of variables that maybe the resident's not aware of, or maybe the TAC just needs to have a better understanding of before it acts.
I think that's true. I think it really goes to what the committee's purpose and function is. Bottom line is it's an advisory committee. So unlike the city council and unlike the planning board, the TAC doesn't really set policy in stone for the city, but it does help to guide city practice when it comes to matters concerning transportation. One of the things that Michael has been extremely good at over his time on the committee, and then much more recently as he's taken over the chair role, is looking at the big picture and trying to steer the conversation to an overall sense of, this is just one little nutshell, but generally speaking, what are some of the larger issues. He brings a perspective in transit that we often forget or lose sight of in terms of like the transit user or the expectation of a transit bus driver in being able to navigate a certain road or a certain intersection, and whether we need to look at public safety, parking restrictions or traffic patterns, whatnot. So, not to get straight too much off topic, but that's generally what I keep trying to remind myself as the staff liaison is it's an advisory committee. It's very helpful to have the committee to be able to endorse, okay, this is kind of the direction we want to go when it comes to ranking locations for new crosswalks, if there were any, or ranking locations where we would want to install supplemental traffic measures at crosswalks, those rectangular rapid flashing beacons, which is like the push button activated system. TAC is very, especially in recent years, has kind of adopted more of a helpful role in prioritizing what we have for existing inventory and what are the hot spots and where should we focus our resources, whether it's in school zones or in the downtown area or you name it. I mean, you can't prioritize everything, so it's necessary and helpful to be able to kind of prioritize a few things.
Along that lines of being advisory, one of the things that I think must come into your considerations, Michael, is that you don't have a budget. Unlike, say, the city council that, as Martin was mentioning, has a budget or at least is controlling of the overall budget. The TAC is advisory. So we can say to the council, we would advise that you spend money on traffic calming or on crosswalk design, but it doesn't have a checkbook itself to effectuate things. Is that frustrating to you or is that liberating to you because you don't have to keep that in mind?
It can be frustrating. I think one of the challenges is that we do try to look at the big picture. We try to prioritize where capital investments like the flashing beacons for crosswalks may go. And those decisions, often we can identify the next 10 priorities, but in reality, that's many years worth of budget that's likely to be set aside. And so we have an individual bringing a concern to us. We've thought about the big picture. We've tried to lay out our priorities, but then we have someone where the concern that they have is immediate and often quite personal. They're talking about their neighborhood, their feeling of safety in their neighborhood or for their children, and they want something done with that. And so it's trying to balance the big picture and giving an answer that aligns with those priorities, but also genuinely listening to the citizens' concerns and understanding that maybe there are times where we need to reprioritize based on new information, but often that's not the case and not something that we can take immediate action on. And so there is this tension between moving forward priorities that are going to make the community safer, more walkable, make the transportation system work better, but also often feeling like we're saying no to someone who's bringing a concern that is very important, yes, in their life.
Right, and I suspect there's that fine line between the compassionate saying no and the no. And people might hear one, but you actually are saying the other. You're trying to say, we totally understand. We appreciate you being here tonight, but for the following reasons, it doesn't meet our policies or it doesn't meet. A typical one I got to think of is, I recall, Marn, that we would hear from time to time people saying, can't you just make the speed limit on my road 25 or 15 or X? Not recognizing that there's statutory guidance on the speed limits or really advisories, and that there are certain criteria that are needed to set a speed below a certain point. People think, I saw in one community I was traveling that they had a local road a speed of 20. Why can't we do that? And especially if that community isn't in this state, it makes it harder to have that conversation, but we can't control what other communities do.
Right. And data doesn't always feel compassionate.
Right.
Some people really seem to understand the data and why a decision is being made or the impacts it has on the fire department, something that they may not have thought of when thinking of their solutions, but it doesn't always communicate that way. And so that can be a challenging road to walk.
Yeah, 100%. In the instances where we are able to collect data, often the data can be interpreted one way by a citizen who's like Michael says, passionate about a particular subject, and then professional engineering analysis, which looks at the 85th percentile of traffic speeds, volumes, how that compares, how that sorts out by times of day. And the engineering analysis might say, we don't really have a glaring problem on this particular roadway. But the citizen may look at that and say, look, I see that there's 2 cars between the 3 and the 4 o'clock hour that were traveling more than 15 over the speed limit. That is a problem that needs to be addressed. And trying to balance that or trying to sort that out in a tactful and compassionate way is sometimes a challenge for the committee. And frankly, we don't always, it's not always a 9-0 vote for the committee. There are different methods and approaches. And, Michael looking at something from a public transit may not necessarily align with the law enforcement approach. And then Michael and I might not necessarily agree on a particular issue, but at the same time, one of our goals is to try to come up with some consensus and kind of move forward or make a recommendation based on consensus. And that's where, it comes down to a vote sometimes. And then it's like record that vote in the minutes and then move forward with that. And then it becomes the role of city staff and most often community services to implement something that's been recommended that's specific in nature, budgeting for it, prioritizing it in conjunction with all of the other utility and infrastructure projects. And it gets difficult. Sometimes some things get lost in the shuffle. Some things just can't be prioritized from a budgetary perspective, even though the committee was unanimous on it.
One of the things that I think, Martin, you alluded to a little while ago, but I want to just clue the listener in on is you mentioned that sometimes parking is a consideration in how the traffic flow over a road looks. And it's good to note that the committee is focused on transportation itself. The parking aspects, while there might be an overlap, it really is the purview of the Parking Commission. Probably 20 years ago, it was a similar board to do both, but now they've been separated for about 20 years. And in this role for transportation advisory, looking at how we travel our roadways, how we utilize them, that is the purview of the Transportation Advisory Commission versus the Parking Commission, which is looking at managing and enforcement of the actual on-street parking.
So the Parking Commission, when it was created out of necessity, was to help prioritize how the city manages its supply, primarily of downtown parking. And when it comes to management, I mean, we've, historically had timed parking in the downtown or metered parking in the downtown, and it's kind of changed over the years. And that's really been the role of the police department in managing that. And that goes back, much longer than 20 years. But when it comes to the growth of the downtown, you need to have a parking system that manages that revenue from meters and uses that revenue effectively and adds to the parking supply when it comes to building a municipal garage, things like that. Those are policy and management issues that the Parking Commission tackled. The Transportation Advisory Commission, as it kind of split off, still has an involvement in parking, but more from a public safety perspective. Mm-hmm. When it comes to, I can't see out of my driveway, or I can't see as I'm trying to turn this corner, and I need more than just the standard 20-foot buffer of parking, that's where the TAC plays a role in trying to balance the supply of public parking versus, okay, we have a public safety issue here that we need to address for the benefit of the motoring public. That's where the TAC gets more involved in parking restrictions, making recommendations, particularly outside the urban core. But occasionally there's a public safety issue in the downtown area, and then sometimes there'll be an issue that actually needs to go to both committees for discussion and endorsement. So
years ago, a hot topic was truck traffic, Jake breaks, that sort of conversation. Has that pretty much all been resolved at this point, or is there still concern about local road use by more than just your UPS, FedEx delivery type trucks? I
wouldn't say that it's necessarily been resolved. Certainly as the committee or as the city grows and there's particularly more downtown infrastructure and the buildings go up, new people come into the city, they have new expectations. As different neighborhoods change. People have different expectations of what's happening on their road. I would say the overall concerns did decrease substantially in 2008 when the committee most recently adopted a comprehensive ordinance. See, prior to that, it was kind of a squeaky wheel gets the grease type of an approach. You know, the residents of this particular street would say, we don't want trucks on our street. And if they made enough noise, the committee endorsed it. It went to the city council, and then those streets became listed specifically in the ordinance as you can't drive trucks here, you can't drive trucks there. The TAC really tried to adopt a more comprehensive approach, recognizing that we have to build buildings, we have to transport goods and services, and there's a need for truck traffic versus there's a need to protect our local roads from the heavy pounding of trucks. So trying to come up with a balance that involved state roadways that traverse the city and then certain other roadways that you need to traverse on in order to get from point A to point B, and then essentially restricting all local roads. But there's often exceptions, particularly depending on the origin or destination of that truck, which has to get to a certain destination. There have to be some exceptions made for local traffic. And then, frankly, there are some trucking companies that they would just want to get the quickest amount of time to get from point A to point B is following my GPS and taking the most direct route. And that doesn't often jive with our local ordinance. So it's more rare these days for the concerns to come in, but I still field calls from citizens with concerns. There are still citizens who think that we need to do better to restrict the noise of trucks. The use of engine compression braking systems is something that the city has been resistant to pass into local ordinance. We most recently dealt with this about a year or two ago. The police department kind of took a laissez-faire approach to say, because we're going to be charged with enforcing it,
right,
we don't have an opinion on it. Let's have the committee do some research on it. And there were some committee members who did quite a bit of research on it. And quite frankly, in so many of the communities around us, you have these signs and ordinances that were passed, and almost universally, they're just not enforced because of the challenges with enforcing it, or just because the local police departments don't have the resources to enforce it. So that's been a little bit of a push-pull lately, but by and large, truck traffic in general seems to people accept it, people understand that it's necessary, and then occasionally there's an issue that kind of crops up, and we usually try to address that either with a phone call or with a appropriately placed police officer to stop a truck or two to kind of nip it in the bud.
Michael, as we wrap up this conversation, could you tell the listener when the TAC meets and how often they meet and how someone might get an item on the agenda?
The TAC meets on Monday evenings at 6 p.m. every 2 months. And the best way to get an item on the agenda is to reach out directly to Lieutenant Spidell, or you could reach out to myself as well, and we would communicate and get that item on the agenda. We heavily encourage that citizens who bring an item forward for the agenda attend the meeting and speak to that item. An email can only communicate so much, and it's very important that we have an opportunity to have a discussion and really understand what it is the concern that you're bringing, and have you participate in that feedback with us. And as we wrap up, I also want to say, going back to your introduction, when you talked about how this committee has both staff members who vote, but also citizen representatives, that it's important that it is that way, in my opinion, because there is a lot of data that needs to be analyzed or collected. There's a lot of technical expertise that needs to be brought to the table, but then there's also the priorities of what do we want for our community that citizens bring. And so the citizen representatives rely a lot on the city staff, who do a fantastic job in preparing reports or analyzing solutions and communicating back to the committee what that would mean, or what the data is telling us, what the federal regulations are around that area. So they bring a lot of expertise to the table that we need in order to make good decisions. But then, of course, the citizens bring the perspective of the community as well. And so it's a good partnership from what I've seen.
Great. Well, I appreciate that summation. I think you hit the nail on the head about the collaborative efforts and the way you reinforce each other, the staff with the technical expertise, the citizenry with the community perspective, both are incredibly important, especially with transportation, because it all affects us all. I like to think that there are 33,000 traffic engineers in this city. We all travel the roads. We all have experience. We all have opinions about who should not be on my road, or we all seem to forget that when we're driving on someone else's road, we should treat it as if it's our own road. And so that would be the message I would leave people with, is when you're out there driving, pretend that you live on that road and watch out for the pedestrians, watch out for the bicyclists, watch out for your other vehicles that may be traveling on that road, and think about your perspective as their perspective. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dover has a wealth of history in its over 400 years of existence. Coming up, Mike Gillis is going to share some of that history with us.
This week, in 2001, over 100 parishioners gathered at Saint George Maronite Catholic Church in Dover to celebrate 53 years of spiritual fellowship and cultural heritage. Among the attendees were then Governor Jean Shaheen, who shared personal connections to the church where her children were baptized, and the mayor-elect, Alex Nassif. The story of St. George's begins with the arrival of Lebanese immigrants to Dover's seacoast area at the turn of the 20th century. These newcomers joined a vibrant tapestry of ethnic communities, including Irish, French Canadian, and Greek immigrants, who had already made Dover their home. By the mid-1930s, the growing Lebanese community sought to preserve their spiritual and cultural heritage, leading to the formation of the Saint George Maronite Society in 1939 with approximately 50 members. The church building itself carries a rich history. Originally known as Lothrop Memorial Hall, it served as Dover's gymnasium and was part of the St. John's Church complex. In 1941, the Maronite Society purchased the building, transforming it into their spiritual home. 7 years later, in 1948, the Diocese of Manchester formally established St. George Maronite Catholic Church, with Reverend Rukas Najjar appointed as its first priest. The church's traditions reflect both its ancient origins and modern adaptations. While the congregation now sings in English rather than Syriac, an Aramaic dialect used in ancient Syrian churches, they maintain the original melodies, creating a bridge between past and present. This connection to tradition was emphasized during the 2001 celebration by Bishop Stephen Hector Dwehi of the Eparchy of St. Maron of Brooklyn, who noted how the spirit of the church's founders remained alive in the congregation. The church's impact extends beyond religious services. It serves as a cornerstone of Dover's Lebanese American community, fostering strong bonds among its members. While the church experienced challenges, including a period when attendance dwindled to about 20 parishioners, it has shown remarkable resilience. Under the leadership of Reverend Bartholomew Leon in 2001, the church was experiencing a rebirth with plans to expand its youth program and religious education initiatives. Today, St. George Maronite Catholic Church continues to serve its community, welcoming all who seek to worship. Services incorporate both English and Syriac, honoring both their American present and their Lebanese heritage.
Thanks for listening to the Dover Download this week. If you like what you heard, subscribe through your favorite podcast aggregator. And if you have something you want to hear a topic on, let us know. Finally, this is just one of the many ways we share information about the city of Dover. You can subscribe to the Dover Downloads email newsletter every week, or other newsletters that we have, by going to the City of Dover homepage, www.dover.nh.gov. Have a great week.